Alright, in this video we are going to take a look at our phylum Chordata that is over here, and this group of animals is different from all the rest of them because they have a thing called a notochord, and we will take a look at this when we look at some of the characteristics of the animals in this phylum. But notice the majority, or I should say all the animals we've looked at up until this point, and then a few in the chordates are invertebrates here. And so these are animals that do not have bones around their spine that are known as vertebrae. If we look within this phylum Chordata, these animals are characterized by the presence of four key structures that are going to appear sometime during their lifetime, either in the embryonic stage or in the adult stage. And the first one that we can look at is what's known as the notochord again, that where you get that chordata from. And this is basically a flexible kind of rod-shaped structure that you can find in the embryonic stage of all the chordates that are out there, and in the adult stage of some of them. It's basically between the digestive tube and the nerve cord, and this is going to give support throughout the entire length of the body. When you look at the vertebrates that are out there, this is what actually gets replaced by the vertebral column, or what we refer to as the spine. If we take a look at the second key characteristic, we see this dorsal hollow nerve cord. So again, there's that word dorsal. Again, think dorsal fin. On a shark that's out there, you're going to see the fin on the dorsal side of their body. And the nerve cord here is really kind of interesting because it is actually ectoderm. That is the surface of the skin that really sinks below the surface of the skin, and then it rolls up into forming this hollow tube during development. This is eventually going to develop into your brain and your spinal cord, or your central nervous system. So when you look at that, remember that is coming from the ectoderm. So your skin and your nervous system have the same origins if you go all the way back to the gastrula phase. If we look at a third characteristic, we see our pharyngeal slits right here. And these are basically openings into the pharynx region that is just behind the mouth. And these openings are what extend to the outside environment. So they're going to be used by some of the organisms to filter the food from the water. Fish are going to modify and turn them into gills or jaw supports. And if you look at the land-based chordata animals that are out there, this is going to form the inner ear and the tonsils. Our last characteristic that we will see in this group is this post-anal tail, and basically it's an elongation of the body that extends beyond the anus there, and this is going to be used in locomotion in a lot of organisms that are out there. So think fish that have this tail right here, and the skeleton and the muscles are going to fuse back here and be used for locomotion or moving that animal around. If we look at the chordata group that is out there, we do start to see some interesting kinds of features here. And there are three groups of invertebrates that do have these chordata characteristics that are out there. And this is one really interesting group out there. It's the subphylum Tunicata, or the tunicates, which their common name is sea squirts. And if you look during the larval form over here, they do display these characteristics: the notochord, that dorsal hollow nerve cord, your pharyngeal slits, and that post-anal tail. So the larva form is actually going to be able to swim around in the ocean after they hatch from the bodies that you would find in the adult tunicate's body. They swim around and they find a surface where they can attach, and then they're actually going to attach by what is effectively their head to the rock or wherever, and that's where they undergo this metamorphosis into the adult form. They do keep those pharyngeal slits, and this is going to be used to filter things. So you're basically going to have water going through these guys, and they will be able to pull out some of the organic material in there and digest it inside their body. So really a strange kind of life when we look at them. All right, and if we switch gears, we see another interesting form of life out there, and this is known as a lancelet. And they're basically named because they look kind of like lances, or this blade-like shape. They're only going to be a few centimeters long, so imagine like 2 or 3 pinky lengths or pinky wits, I should say. And you're going to find them buried in the sand, usually around tropical areas. And these guys are also going to be feeders off of the small materials that are floating around out there. If you look closely at the cartoon over here, you can see they do have that notochord and that hollow nerve cord right there. They've got their pharyngeal slits. They've got that coelom with that complete digestive tract, and then they do have this nice little post-anal tail there. So they've got all of these characteristics of the chordata, even in that adult phase right there. And when we look at fossils out there, you can actually find these guys going back more than 500 million years ago. We can find fossilized evidence of land slits being around out there. All right, we look at our last group of invertebrates here. So animals that are lacking those vertebrae around their spine there, and we find an organism that I actually worked with as an undergraduate, and it's known as a hagfish. And people look at this and they think these are eels, but they are not eels. They are eel-like in terms of this, but they are distinctly different. They have sort of part of the bones in their cranium to protect their brains, but they do not have a jaw. And that notochord is going to run along the length of the body and give them support right here. So these guys, again, they don't replace that notochord with the vertebral column, so that's why they're classified as invertebrates. And you can see they are basically a long tube of muscle when you're looking at them. And they're just going to live down in the bottom of the ocean, and they're scavenger fish. They're basically feeding on dead animals that sink to the bottom, and then the hagfish actually digs into the mud and lives in there, kind of like what we saw with the land slits. All right, now we move up, if you can call that up, to looking at chordates with some spine. And now we run into vertebrates that are out there. They're going to have a full cranium or bones to protect their brains, and then that spine with all these vertebrae going down there. So think about your backbones that are out there. And we've identified more than 62,000 vertebrate species that are out there. When you look at the other characteristics, they do have endoskeletons, so interior skeletons like what we saw with the echinodermata that are out there. And again, they have that cranium and they do have that backbone with those vertebrae. And if we look at the really most ancient kind of vertebrate that's out there, it's a really pretty kind of fish known as a lamprey here. And these guys, they do have a bony brain case around here to protect their brains, but their vertebrae are not quite complete here, but they are at least starting to form some bones around there. When you look at the lamprey, they don't have a jaw right here. They have this weird funnel-like mouth that they will use to attach to other organisms that are out there. And they can basically suck or feed off of the fluids inside of them. And here you can see two lampreys that are actually stuck on this fish right here. So a little bit ugly, but also a little bit interesting. And the hypothesis is that these jawless fish eventually started to develop a little bit more besides the spine. They developed some jaws, so some bones on their face right there. And if you look at these two clades, these are two groups of fish that have basically taken that lamprey and gone a little bit further. And the chondrichthyes that are out there, you're looking at fishes that have cartilage. And so if you look at a shark that's out there, they're going to have basically a flexible skeleton of cartilage. So feel your nose and feel your ear that's out there, and you're feeling this protein that is making up this flexible skeleton. These guys are thought to have actually descended from some fish that were out there that had a skeleton made of bone, and then they lost that boniness over time right there. And so they think that these are almost like an evolutionary throwback that actually became very, very successful when you look at things like sharks and rays that are out there. When you look at the osteichthyes down here on the bottom, the osteo is bone, and ichthyes over here is fish. So literally their clade name is bony fish. And again, you can see they do have some of the same evolutionary adaptations, like this lateral line that they can use to actually detect really the presence of electric fields in their surroundings, but one big difference is when you look at the bony fish that are out there, besides having this calcium basis on their bones, on the cartilage that's out there, they also have this bony flap over here that they can basically flap out, and that's going to allow them to move fluids across their gills and get oxygen, where a shark has to keep swimming out there in order to keep those fluids moving past its gills so that it can continue to breathe. So a fish can sit still where a shark needs to keep moving. And that freaks some people out when they look at the sharks in aquariums. They see that the sharks never really stop moving there. All right, so now we can take this next step. We've seen all of these advances as these organisms are getting more and more complex in the ocean, but what about terrestrial animals that are out there? And the hypothesis is that these fish that were out there started to head to land. And this is an artist's depiction based on some fossil evidence where they found this kind of fish that was out there. And if you look closely, you can see that these paired fins are starting to develop into something that is like a primitive foot that's out there. And so they think this is the ancestor of what are known as the tetrapods, or terrestrial vertebrates that have 4 feet. And so fish that basically had fins with muscles, and then they took a bladder inside of their body that they were using, and they repurposed that, and that became the lungs that are out there. We can see some modern examples of these. So again, modern descendants, this is what's known as a lungfish, and it does have these 4 fins that it can use to sort of drag itself along really shallow, muddy areas that are out there, and it has that modified swim bladder that can actually function as a lung to absorb oxygen. And we do find these on a couple of different continents out there. So this might be a modern day version or a descendant of some of these vertebrates, these transitional fossils that we find out there. And if you take a look at what happened with these vertebrates, well, now when they head onto land, think about what happened with the algae when they became plants. You had to develop these very specific kind of adaptations to allow you to survive. So you're going to see some similarities in terms of these terrestrial adaptations. But when we look at the tetrapods that are out there, land-based animals that have these 4 feet, we find that there are 3 major groups of terrestrial animals that are out there. And we'll see that a lot of these things that are out there we know of because of fossil evidence. A lot of them have actually died off and gone extinct over time. So if we look at the first kind of vertebrates that headed to land out here, think about what they had to do. These were fish that moved onto land, and so we can see this sort of transition even with some of the amphibians that are out there. And if you look at amphibian, this literally means dual life. And so we're looking at organisms that have these sort of adaptations to life in the water, but also adaptations to life on land. But kind of like with the bryophytes, they still need water to reproduce and go through some of the parts of their land. And here you can see this metamorphosis from an aquatic larva to that terrestrial adult. The larvae actually do have gills and that lateral line system and the fins, but they don't have limbs like you can see here as they're going through metamorphosis right there. In terms of the adult, one of the things that they have is a very moist kind of skin that's out there, and they're going to release secretions through mucus glands that actually allow them to breathe through their skin, so oxygen and CO2 can be exchanged with their environment that are out there. And when you look at the amphibians, you can see some of these examples with our frogs, but also things like salamanders that are out there. Some of these salamanders actually are lacking completely in lungs, and their respiration is going to occur through their skin or through some gill structures that they have. So again, you can see this variation in terms of body architecture that is occurring with some of these organisms.